Welcome to Chapter 3 of the Investments book, Bodie, Kane, and Marcus. This chapter is about initial public offerings, how to enter trade orders. There's various types of orders you can enter with a broker or online. And we're also going to talk about the end of this chapter about buying on margin, using margin, and selling short. That's something you've heard about but may not know a lot about. So how do firms issue new securities? So remember, companies usually start out their life as a private company, not being publicly traded, held by fewer shareholders. It would be as if you and your cousin went out and started a company to do pet grooming or whatever. Companies start small and grow from there typically, and hopefully at some point go public. So when that time comes, the company creates shares to sell to the public, and there's something called the primary market. That's the first time new shares are sold. The company is the issuer. They issue the shares and they get the money from the sale. And then later on, whoever bought those newly minted shares may decide to sell them, and that's said to occur in the secondary market, that second sale of security. In that case, of course, the company doesn't get the money. It goes to the current shareholder who sells his shares to someone else. So all the shares trading out there in the secondary market, the company really doesn't benefit from that financially. They don't get a return on that, on those trades. Typically a privately held, so just notice here, I know being online, we have to be careful with what we read. So we've got a column here for privately held shares or companies and publicly traded companies. So shareholders, I think the Jobs Act in 2012 raised the limit of the number of shareholders that could be in a privately held company or could be marketed to, without registering with the SEC. 2,000 shareholders is the limit. Beyond that, the company has to register with the SEC. A publicly traded company, there is no limit. Of course, the SEC requires regular financial statements to be published of public companies, not as high a requirement on privately held companies. So the big difference is that privately held companies, few investors, a publicly traded company is really available nearly to the whole world. Anyone that can access the exchange that trades in the shares of a particular company can buy shares in that company. So typically when shares are sold, when we go public, an initial public offering, that requires the services of an underwriter, or also known as an investment banker. So that's kind of how that process starts out. In fact, we're going to go a little deeper here. So like we said a second ago, private companies go public with an IPO or initial public offering. And typically, not always, but typically the underwriters actually purchase the securities from the company and then they resell them. And another term you need to be aware of is the term prospectus. That is a document that gives the details of the firm, how many shares are going to be offered, any risk to investors that might invest in it are disclosed in the prospectus. So there's a few key terms on this slide that you'll want to remember, but before I comment on that, I want to say that the last slide that mentioned the underwriters actually purchase the shares from the company. There's three types of underwriting methods in the United States, and that is a firm commitment underwriting that the underwriters purchase the shares. There's another type called best efforts underwriting and a Dutch auction, but for now, we're talking about a firm commitment underwriting. At any rate, regardless of the type, the issuer, that is the company, and the underwriter or investment banker, same group. These are large companies like Goldman Sachs that also help companies IPO shares. They put on what's called a roadshow, and they travel around the country, you know, offer nice food and entertainment to wealthy investors, many of them institutions, to promote these new shares that are about to be offered on the exchange. Um, and the reason they do that is something called book building. So they're trying to build a book of investors that say they're interested in buying these new shares in this new company that's going public, right? Or a company. It may not be a new company. They may have been around as a private company for years, but they're going to be newly public. So part of the idea is to build the book, who's interested, and secondly, to get an idea of what they can charge for these shares. So there's another term you need to know called underpricing. And that is that typically the very first day that shares come out, that they are the IPO day, the day that they go public, the first day, the prices usually go up around 10% or more on average, and that is called underpricing. And it's called underpricing because the company is getting less for their shares than the market determines their worth during the first day. So the difference in the close, the price at the close of the first day of trading, the difference between that and the IPO price, the price that they were sold to investors at in the primary market, is called underpricing. Average is 10% plus. Very lucrative if you can get access to new shares, but almost impossible, even for big hitters, wealthy investors. There's this term called the winner's curse that if you can get IPO shares, it's usually because others don't want them. So not really, the hard to get shares, IPO shares, are the ones that have the largest underpricing. That benefits investors, but is to the detriment of the issuing firm because they get less in the IPO price than they close at that first day. So be familiar with those terms. So this graph is an example of underwriting syndicate. The underwriting syndicate simply refers to a group of investment bankers that all work together to float the new shares or to sell them. They're led by the lead underwriter. The lead underwriter gets the deal with the issuing firm. This is some salesmanship here that the investment bankers compete to land the deal of leading this IPO. They advise the issuing firm and they form a syndicate to help sell them to the private investors. And it's sort of a good old boy club that if this investment banker A lands the deal here and is the lead underwriter, he's going to bring in his buddies. And if investment banker D lands it, he's going to bring in his buddies. So it's you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that's sort of how that works. So in my opinion, this slide should be labeled underpricing. And you saw it there at the beginning there. It's also known as the first day returns or first day pop. That's how much the newly issued shares go up the very first day. Like I already mentioned, you can see the U.S. here is over, it's more like 15% on average. Look at Greece, the first day pop, 50% shares go up. And this is an average of a number of years, but some years in the U.S., IPO first day pop will average 50%, 70%. So that is considered money left on the table by the company. That first day, the market determines what those shares are worth, and it is typically much more than the company got paid for them. So there's a guy over in the University of Florida named Ritter that tracks this and has for many years. So it's a very interesting phenomena I encourage you to read more about underpricing. Fascinating. Another terminology thing you should know is called shelf registration. It was approved under Rule 415 of the Security Exchange Commission. And what this means is that the company can get more shares registered than they intend to sell right away. And they can put them on the shelf. That's why it's called shelf registration. And they can sell them any time during the next 2 years. They can sell those shares. So the reason that companies use Rule 415 is because it's very costly. The accounting and legal expenses and management expenses to internal and external are very high, very expensive. So if a company is going to go through registration to offer shares to the public, they like to get enough approved to carry them for their equity needs for the next 2 years. So that's the point of shelf registration.